Paris, July 25th, 1944, a cramped apartment in the 8th arrondissement. The city is sweltering, nervous, buzzing with the kind of tension that only comes when an empire is starting to crack. The D-Day landings had happened 6 weeks earlier. The Allies were pushing east. Everyone in Paris could feel it, even the German soldiers, even the Gestapo agents on the Rue des Saussaies. There was a clock ticking. One side was counting down to victory, the other was counting down to something far worse. Inside a small, unremarkable apartment, a young woman sits in front of a suitcase. She's 23 years old, dark hair, sharp eyes, small build. She doesn't look like a spy. She doesn't look dangerous at all. But inside that suitcase is a wireless radio set, and she's been using it to run messages between the French resistance and British intelligence for 5 months straight. 105 transmissions. Every single one of them could have gotten her killed. She knew that going in, and she did it anyway. Her name was Eileen Nearne. Her codename was Rose, and today the Germans had finally found her. She heard something, a sound from next door. Not right, not normal. She packed up fast, destroyed the message she'd just sent, hid the wireless. And then the pounding started on her door. She opened it. There was a man standing in the doorway pointing a pistol directly at her face. Behind him, more men. He had the flat, trained eyes of someone who had done this dozens of times before. Someone who had stood in front of hundreds of doors in this city, pointing a gun, watching for exactly the wrong kind of reaction. A flinch, a glance toward a hiding spot, a split second of the wrong kind of fear. Talk and save yourself. Stay quiet and risk everything. She had about 1 second to decide which kind of person she was going to be. She chose silence. That choice was going to cost her more than you can imagine. Torture, concentration camps, forced labor, months of pure hell. But she never broke. Not once. Not a single name. Not one address. Nothing. This is the story of a woman who the British government itself once called scatterbrained. A woman who was told she wasn't smart enough to be a spy. A woman who went to Nazi-occupied France at 23 years old and held the line so hard, so completely, that even after everything they did to her, the Germans never got a thing out of her. Not one useful word. And then she came home, and she never told anyone. For decades, she just put on a wig and tried to disappear. That's what I want to talk to you about today. That's what this story is really about. Not just the courage she showed when the Gestapo was asking the questions, but the courage it takes to carry something like that, alone, quietly, for 50 years, and never once ask anyone to acknowledge it. Stick with me, because this story goes places that are going to shake you. And if you're the kind of person who believes in real courage, not the Hollywood kind, not the stuff they put in recruiting posters, but the kind that happens in the dark when no one's watching and the outcome is genuinely uncertain and the cost of getting it wrong is your life, then you need to hear every single minute of this. This is a story about what a human being can actually endure when they've decided what they stand for. Let's go back to the beginning. Eileen Mary Nearne was born on March 16, 1921, in London, England. Her father, John Nearne, was English. Her mother, Marie de Plazoala, was Spanish. She was the youngest of 4 children. Her siblings were Jacqueline, Francis, and Frederick. From the very beginning, the Nearne family was not what you'd call conventional. They weren't exactly rolling in money. They were cultured, multilingual, and a little scattered across the world in the way that expatriate families often were in that era between the wars. In 1923, when Eileen was only 2 years old, the family packed up and moved to France, specifically to the south of France, eventually settling for good in Grenoble, in the foothills of the Alps. And here's the thing about growing up in France as an English kid. You become something that most English kids never become. You become fluent. Genuinely fluent. Not schoolbook French, not tourist French. Real French. Street French. The kind of French where you dream in the language. Eileen Nearne grew up speaking French like a native, which, when the time came, would be the single most important qualification she had. She also grew up as the baby of the family, the youngest, the one that everyone sort of assumed was a little soft, a little more delicate than her older sister Jacqueline, who was bold and decisive and seemed born for the kind of work that was coming. Eileen was funny and a little scatterbrained in the way that smart young women sometimes are when the world keeps underestimating them. She had a quick mind, but a quiet presence. She wasn't the first person who walked into a room and grabbed all the attention. She was the person you wouldn't notice until she was already gone. That quality, that ability to be invisible in plain sight, was going to matter enormously. Then came 1940, and the world changed. May 10th, 1940. The German Wehrmacht punched through the Ardennes and drove into France with a speed and ferocity that stunned the entire world. The French army, the British Expeditionary Force, all of it, just rolled up and crushed. By June 22nd, France had surrendered. The armistice was signed. Nazi Germany had done in 6 weeks what it hadn't been able to do in 4 years of grinding warfare between 1914 and 1918. For the French people, for the British citizens living there, for anyone who wasn't German and wasn't willing to collaborate, life just ended. The occupation began immediately. German soldiers on the boulevards, German flags on the buildings, German orders on every wall. The Vichy government, the puppet regime that pretended to run southern France while doing whatever Berlin told it, made everything official. France was under the boot. Eileen was 19 years old. She and her older sister Jacqueline were in the south of France, well away from the German advance. But they both understood immediately that this situation was not something they could just wait out. The rest of the Nearne family would stay in Grenoble, where their parents were. But the 2 young women made a decision. They were going to get to England. They were going to fight. What followed was one of the more extraordinary border-crossing journeys of the whole war, and there were a lot of extraordinary border-crossing journeys in World War II. The 2 sisters made their way across occupied France into Spain, from Spain to Portugal, then to Gibraltar, and finally by ship to Glasgow, Scotland. Think about that route for a second. Barcelona, Madrid, Lisbon, Gibraltar. That's not a weekend. Trip. Every border crossing was a risk. The wrong papers, the wrong question, the wrong moment of hesitation, and the whole thing falls apart. They made it. They arrived in England in 1942. Now, here's where the story starts to get into the kind of territory that should make every one of you feel something. Because when Eileen Nearne arrived in England, ready to contribute, ready to fight in whatever way she could, the British government looked at her and said, "You know what? You'd be good at barrage balloons." Barrage balloons. You know what those are? Giant tethered floating blimps deployed over cities to make it harder for enemy aircraft to fly low. Not glamorous, not dangerous. Desk work and equipment maintenance. Eileen turned it down. She had other ideas. She was recruited by the Special Operations Executive, the SOE. If you don't know what that organization was, let me give you a quick briefing. The SOE was Winston Churchill's personal answer to the problem of Nazi-occupied Europe. Standard military strategy, armies, navies, air forces, couldn't do anything about countries that were already under German control. You needed something different. You needed people who could go in under cover, blend in, build networks, Sabotage railway lines, blow up infrastructure, feed intelligence back to London, help the local resistance. Make the occupation so costly, so uncertain, so dangerous that it ground down the German war machine from the inside. Churchill called it setting Europe ablaze, and the SOE was the match. And here's the thing about the SOE that most people don't fully appreciate. They sent women, deliberately. They realized very quickly that women could do things male agents couldn't. Women could move around more freely in occupied France. A man of military age traveling alone raised eyebrows. A young woman going about her business was unremarkable. Women were less likely to be stopped, less likely to be suspected. They could carry messages, run safe houses, operate radios, pass intelligence, and do it all while looking like they were just going about ordinary French life. 39 women were sent into occupied France by the SOE. Eileen Nearne was one of them. But first, she had to prove herself, and she was already enrolled in the SOE's home-based signals operation, receiving and decoding secret messages from agents already in the field. Her sister Jacqueline had already been deployed to France as a courier. Officially, they weren't supposed to know about each other's roles, but of course they figured it out. The two sisters, working on opposite sides of the English Channel, both feeding the machine that was trying to bring down the Third Reich. But Eileen wanted more. She wanted to go to France. She wanted to be in the field. She went through the training. That meant months of work scattered across country houses and estates in the British countryside, places requisitioned by the SOE, where they could teach their agents everything they needed to know without the neighbors noticing. Silent killing techniques, how to handle explosives, how to pick a lock, how to lose a tail in a city without looking like you're losing a tail, how to create and maintain a cover identity well enough that even a seasoned interrogator couldn't shake it. Morse code. Hours and hours of Morse code until the alphabet was coded into your fingers as solidly as if it had always been there. And wireless operation. How to set up the set, how to tune the frequencies, how to encode and decode messages using one-time pads, how to manage the security checks that proved to London you weren't transmitting under duress. All of that. For months. Now I want to stop here for just a moment, because this is the part that gets me every time I read about her story. Because we know what happened at the training assessment. We know, because it was declassified and released to the public decades later, exactly what her training officer wrote about Eileen Nearne in the report that was supposed to determine whether she was fit to be deployed to occupied France. He wrote this: "Not very intelligent or practical, and is lacking in shrewdness and cunning, a bad memory, inaccurate and scatterbrained, very feminine and immature." Very feminine and immature. This man, this officer who was supposed to be evaluating whether she had what it took, looked at a 22-year-old woman who had already crossed Nazi-occupied Europe on foot to get to England, who was already working in the signals intelligence operation, who spoke fluent French, and he called her scatterbrained. He wrote that report 1 month before she was parachuted into France. 1 month before she started doing the work that would eventually earn her a medal from the King of England and the highest honor the French government could give. 1 month. I bring this up not to embarrass some long-dead British officer, but because I think most of the men watching this, and I'm talking to you guys directly here, you know what it feels like to be underestimated. Maybe not in exactly this situation, obviously, but you know what it's like to be written off by someone who didn't look closely enough, to be told you don't have what it takes by someone who couldn't see what you actually were. Eileen Nearne could have let that report be the end of it. She could have been sent to barrage balloon duty and just let it go. She didn't. She pushed through. She qualified. And she was sent to France. Now, before we get into the heart of this story, and I promise you we're getting there, I want you to do something for me. If you're enjoying this, if you're the kind of person who believes these stories deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button right now. It costs you nothing, and it's how we know to keep making content like this. The world is full of channels about tanks and generals and battles. Very few people are telling the stories of the women who actually made victory possible. If you're here, you already know that matters. Subscribe, and let's keep going. The night of March 2nd, 1944. Somewhere in central England, a small plane is sitting on an airfield. A Westland Lysander, a compact single-engine aircraft that the SOE used specifically for these kinds of insertions. The Lysander could land on a short field, drop off agents, pick up others, and be gone before anyone knew it had been there. It was the workhorse of clandestine night operations. Eileen Nearne climbed aboard. She was 22 years old. She was carrying a false identity. She was now Mademoiselle Dutour, or, depending on which papers she was using, Jacqueline Duterte or Alice Wood. She had her wireless equipment, she had her mission, and she had the codename that would follow her for the rest of her life. Rose. The plane left English soil and flew southeast, crossing the Channel in the dark, dropping down to low altitude to avoid German radar. Below, in the fields and forests of occupied France, a group of resistance fighters were doing something that took its own kind of nerve. Standing outside in the dark, in German-occupied territory, holding flashlights, marking a landing field for a British spy plane, one wrong informant in the network, one German patrol, and everyone involved goes to a camp or gets shot. The Lysander touched down in a field near Les Lagnies, in the Indre department of central France. In the late hours of March 2nd, bleeding into the early hours of March 3rd. Eileen stepped out. She was on French soil for the first time since she and her sister had fled the occupation 3 years earlier. But this time, she wasn't running away. She was going in. Her partner on the mission was Jean Savy, an experienced SOE operative. Their assignment was to build a network in Paris, codenamed Wizard. The Wizard network's purpose was different from the typical sabotage networks. They weren't blowing up railway lines, at least not directly. Their mission was financial. They were organizing sources of funding for the resistance, money, resources, the logistical lifeblood that kept the whole underground operation alive. Savy was the organizer, the man running the network. Eileen was the wireless operator. Her job was to maintain a radio link back to London, sending and receiving encrypted messages that kept the whole operation connected to British intelligence. She set up in Paris. She found safe houses. She learned her rhythms, her routes, her routines. Every wireless transmission was a race against time. The Germans had radio detection equipment, trucks with directional antennae that could triangulate a signal if you stayed on the air long enough. The rule was to keep transmissions short, go to a different location each time, never develop a pattern, never give them enough time to get a fix on you. Over the next 5 months, Eileen Nearne transmitted 105 messages. 105 times she set up that radio, tapped out her encrypted signals in Morse code, waited for confirmation, packed up and disappeared before the detection trucks could close in. 105 times she took a risk that could end in capture, torture, death, and 105 times she got away with it. Think about what the nerve required to do that looks like. Every single day in Paris in 1944 was dangerous. The city was full of German soldiers, Gestapo agents, French collaborators, informants. Suspicion was everywhere. The French police, many of them cooperating with the occupation, were looking for exactly this kind of operation. You couldn't trust your neighbors. You couldn't be sure about the people running your safe houses. You had to be completely self-contained, completely controlled, completely invisible. And Eileen Nearne was all of those things, every single day. Let me paint you a picture of what one of those days might actually have looked like, because I think we owe it to her to really understand what she was living inside. She woke up in a city under occupation. She stepped outside and the streets were full of German uniforms, Wehrmacht soldiers on every corner, Gestapo agents in plain clothes wandering through the cafes, the parks, the markets. She went about her morning as any ordinary French woman would, picked up bread, maybe said good morning to the concierge of her building, kept her face neutral, her posture unremarkable. Just another Parisian girl getting through the day. Then she'd locate her transmission point for that day. The SOE's protocol was specific. Never use the same location twice in short succession. Never stay on the air for more than 20 minutes. Change frequencies according to the schedule. Use your designated security checks within the message to confirm you hadn't been captured and were transmitting under duress. She'd set up the suitcase that contained the radio in whatever room, apartment, or safe house she was using that day. She'd check the schedule. She'd check her crystals for the correct frequency. She'd encode the message she was carrying. Not in her head, but using a one-time pad, a sheet of code that would be destroyed immediately after use. Then she'd start tapping. Morse code, fast and clean, the kind of fluency that only comes from drilling hundreds of hours until your fingers know the alphabet without you consciously thinking about it. She'd send the message. Wait for the acknowledgement from London, pack everything up, get out, and all of that had to happen in less than 20 minutes. Because after 20 minutes, the German detection trucks, the Funkabwehr, they were called, the radio counterintelligence units, had a reasonable chance of triangulating your position. They drove slowly through the city with their directional antennae, mapping signal strength, narrowing down the radius, closing in. The only defense was speed and movement. Eileen Nearne did this well over 100 times, in a city crawling with people actively trying to find her. Every single time she got away clean. Jean Savy eventually returned to London, carrying critical intelligence about German WWII flying bomb operations that he'd gathered during their time in Paris. When his plane took off from that dark field, Eileen didn't know what was on it. She didn't know that on the same flight, her sister Jacqueline was aboard, being extracted after 15 months in the field. The two sisters passed within feet of each other in the dark and had no idea. Different stages of the same war. One going home, one staying to fight. Eileen continued working alone. She attached herself to a second network, the Spiritualist Network, and kept transmitting, kept the link alive, kept the intelligence flowing. But then came July 25th. Something changed. There was an urgent message that needed to go, out. Her SOE controller, the man she worked under in France, told her not to transmit. The situation was too hot, too many detection units active. Wait it out. She knew the message was important. She knew waiting was the safer choice. She went anyway. She went to her safe house. She set up the radio. She got the message out. And then, just as she was finishing, she heard something from next door. Sounds that weren't right. She moved fast, packed the equipment, destroyed the message, hid everything she could. And then the pounding on the door started. She opened it. The man with the pistol in her face was Gestapo. Behind him were more agents. They searched the apartment, and despite her efforts, they found it. The radio, the equipment, her weapon. Her fingerprints were all over the set. There was no point in denying she was a clandestine wireless operator. They handcuffed her. They put her in a car. They drove her to Paris. The destination was the Rue des Saussaies. "Number 11, If you know your World War II history in France, that address sends a chill down your spine. The Rue des Saussaies was the headquarters of the Gestapo in Paris. It was one of the most feared addresses in occupied Europe. Entire books have been written about what happened inside that building, the interrogation rooms, the isolation cells, the techniques. And the most infamous of those techniques, the one they used on Eileen Nearne, was called the baignoire, the bathtub. The interrogators would take a prisoner, strip them naked, force their head under the water, and hold it there, just long enough. And then they'd pull them back up, sputtering and gasping. Ask the question again, give them 30 seconds to answer, and then back under, over and over, until the person either broke or died. Eileen Nearne later described it herself, in her own words. She said, "They put me in a cold bath and tried to make me speak, but I stuck to the story." 6 words. She stuck to the story. The story was this. She was just a French girl. She'd been helping a businessman send messages for him. She had no idea he was British. She was just a young woman who thought she was doing a favor for a friend. She didn't know anything. She didn't know about any network. She didn't know about any resistance. She was innocent, confused, frightened. Were they buying it? Probably not entirely. The Gestapo agents on the Rue des Saussaies hadn't gotten to their jobs by being naive. They knew she was lying, or at least they suspected it. But here's the problem they had. They couldn't disprove it. Every detail of her cover story held, every answer she gave, even under the baignoire, was consistent. She was a wireless operator, clearly. But they couldn't get her to admit to anything beyond the most basic cover story. They couldn't get names. They couldn't get addresses. They couldn't get network details. They couldn't get anything that would let them follow the chain up through the wizard network and the spiritualist network and unravel the whole operation. She held. Under waterboarding, under the kind of physical and psychological assault that most people can't even imagine from the comfort of an armchair, she held. Professor Michael Foote, who wrote one of the definitive books about the SOE and who had actually met Eileen Nearne, described it this way. He said the Germans caught her at her set. There was no denying she was a clandestine wireless operator because she was with her recognizable set and her fingerprints were all over it. She told them she was just a little shop girl who had gone into the resistance for fun. They didn't believe her, of course, but they couldn't get anything else out of her at all. A little shop girl who had gone into the resistance for fun. She had passed through months of SOE training. She had run one of the most effective intelligence conduits in Paris. She had transmitted 105 messages, and when the Gestapo had her, she played dumb. And it worked just well enough to save the network. The people she knew, the names, the addresses, the safe houses, the contacts, none of it came out. Not one name, not one address. Nothing. I want you to think for a second about what it actually takes to do that. This wasn't a matter of gritting your teeth and pushing through a moment. This was an extended interrogation, multiple sessions, physical torture, sleep deprivation, the constant psychological pressure of knowing that at any moment they could decide you were useless and just shoot you. Most adults in ordinary life have trouble keeping a secret about a surprise birthday party. Eileen Nearne kept secrets that could get people killed while someone was holding her head underwater. That's the kind of person she was, and most of the world didn't know it for 60 years. Now let me ask you something. You know, guys, every one of us has had moments where we've been tested. Not like this. Thank God, not like this. But tested. Moments where it would have been easier to break, to take the path of least resistance, to give in. Maybe it was your time in the service. Maybe it was keeping your mouth shut about something that would have thrown someone else under the bus. Maybe it was just staying loyal when it cost you something. Those moments define you. Eileen Nearne's moment lasted days, and she didn't flinch. If you're enjoying this story, I want to ask you something simple. Hit subscribe. We're about halfway through this, and it gets even heavier from here. If this is the kind of content that matters to you, subscribing is the way to let us know. It takes 1 second, and it means these stories keep getting told. After the interrogation sessions at the Rue des Saussaies, the Gestapo made their decision. They couldn't break her. They couldn't disprove her cover story completely. But they couldn't let her go either. They knew she was involved in something. So they did what they did with everyone they couldn't use but couldn't release. They sent her to a camp. August 15th, 1944. Just 3 days before Paris would be liberated, just 3 days before the German grip on the French capital would finally collapse. 3 days. If they'd held her just a little bit longer, she might have walked free, but the timing of war is merciless. 3 days before liberation, Eileen Nearne was put on a transport to Ravensbrück. Ravensbrück. If you know that name, you know why it sits in the gut like a stone. If you don't know it, Ravensbrück was the main Nazi concentration camp built specifically for women. Located about 50 miles north of Berlin, in a heavily forested area of northern Germany. It was operational from 1939 all the way to the end of the war, and in that time, more than 130,000 women passed through it. Somewhere between 25,000 and 30,000 of them did not survive. The conditions were what you'd expect. Overcrowding, starvation rations, forced labor, brutal guards, arbitrary punishment, death as a constant presence. The women who arrived there were from all over occupied Europe. Jewish women, Roma women, Polish political prisoners, Soviet POWs, resistance fighters from France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway. Women who had done exactly what Eileen Nearne had done, fought back against the occupation. Eileen arrived in August 1944. She refused to work. Now, in the context of a concentration camp, that sounds almost insane. Refusing to follow orders in Ravensbrück was not a peaceful act of civil disobedience. It was a decision that could get you shot. And the SS guards made sure she knew that. They shaved her head. They told her she would be executed if she continued to refuse. She continued to refuse. They could take her freedom. They could take her hair. They could threaten her life. They could not make her work for the Nazi war machine. That was the line she drew, in the middle of a place designed to break people entirely, and she held it. She was eventually transferred out of Ravensbrück, moved to a forced labor camp in Silesia, the eastern German territory that is now part of Poland. The conditions there were different, but no less brutal. More physical labor demands, more exposure to the harsh Central European winter, more of the grinding daily degradation that the camp system was specifically designed to do. Break the body, break the spirit, turn human beings into compliant units of labor. And I want to be honest with you about something here. We don't have Eileen's own detailed account of what happened in those camps. She never fully described it. She carried it quietly for the rest of her life. There are reports, declassified after the war, that suggest she was subjected to further torture during her time in the labor camp in Silesia. We know she saw things that no human being should see. We know she experienced things that left marks on her that never fully healed. But we also know she survived. And more. She escaped. April 13th, 1945. Eileen Nearne was working in a labor gang. The guards had grown more distracted in recent weeks. The news from all fronts was catastrophic for Germany. The Allies were pushing hard from the west. The Soviets were coming from the east. Everyone could feel the end. The guards were nervous. The prisoners were desperate. Everything was fluid. Eileen and two young French women she had befriended in the camp made their move. They slipped away from the work gang. They hid in the forest. They waited. And then they started moving. It wasn't clean. It wasn't quick. They were escaped prisoners in the middle of Germany, in a German-speaking country they didn't know the geography of, heading in the general direction of somewhere the Allies might be. They moved at night when they could. They avoided roads, sticking to the tree lines, the edges of fields, the paths that nobody was likely to be patrolling at 3 in the morning. They were weak. They had been malnourished for months. Their clothing was inadequate for the April nights in central Germany, which are cold and unforgiving. They were hungry the entire time, but they moved, one foot in front of the other, because the alternative was going back. They traveled through Markkleeberg, a town south of Leipzig, and there, once again, they were stopped, not by the work camp guards this time, by the SS, the SS. Even at this stage of the war, with Berlin falling, with everything collapsing, the SS was still operating, still checking papers, still running checkpoints, still capable of executing escaped prisoners without a second thought. These weren't the panicking late-war conscripts who were already hiding their uniforms and preparing to surrender to the nearest American GI. These were SS, ideologically committed, trained to be ruthless, and very much still asking questions and making decisions about who lived and who didn't. Eileen Nearne and her two French companions stood there in front of SS officers and did the same thing Eileen had been doing since July of the previous year. They performed. They lied. They were just French girls, confused, lost, trying to get home. Conscripted workers who had been brought to Germany against their will and were now just trying to find their way back to France in the chaos. They had nothing to do with any camp. They were just civilians caught in the chaos of a collapsing country. "Please, sir, we just want to go home." She had done this before. Against the Gestapo, who were better at this than almost anyone. She had held that story together for months. 3 SS soldiers at a checkpoint in Markkleeberg were not going to break Eileen Nearne, and somehow, impossibly, it worked again. The SS let them go. She must have walked away from that checkpoint without looking back, without running, without giving them any reason to call after her. Just 3 tired women shuffling down a road in the spring of 1945, unremarkable, not worth the trouble. They continued moving. They eventually made their way to Leipzig, where, according to the account that has been pieced together from various sources, they were taken in by a Catholic priest who hid them until American troops arrived. A priest in Leipzig. Think about his courage for a second, too. By April 1945, Leipzig was not a safe place to be hiding escaped foreign prisoners. The city was under Allied aerial bombardment. SS units were still operating. Nazi hardliners were still shooting people they suspected of defeatism or disloyalty. German civilians, not just prisoners. And here was this priest taking in 3 exhausted women who had just escaped from a labor camp, feeding them, sheltering them, keeping them alive and out of sight until the Americans got there. The courage operating in and around Eileen Nearne's story is not hers alone. It's the resistance fighters marking that landing field in the dark in 1944. It's the contacts who ran the safe houses in Paris. It's the 2 French women who escaped alongside her and held their nerve through the same checkpoint she did. It's this priest in Leipzig whose name we don't even know. History remembers the people it can find the files on. The rest of them just did what needed doing and disappeared back into ordinary life. The Americans arrived. Eileen was free. She was thin, exhausted, and carrying 9 months of things that no one around her could fully see. but she was alive, and she had made it through every single test they had put in front of her. It was April 1945. Germany would not formally surrender until May 8th, so for another few weeks, the war technically continued. But for Eileen Nearne, captured in July 1944 and liberated in April 1945, 9 brutal months had just ended. The wireless operator codenamed Rose, who had held under the baignoire and survived Ravensbrück and refused to break in every possible circumstance. She was free. She was 24 years old. She had survived the Gestapo, Ravensbrück, a forced labor camp in Silesia, an SS checkpoint, and a cross-country escape through collapsing Nazi Germany. She had never broken, not once, not a single name, not a single address, not one piece of operationally useful information had come out of her during those 9 months. She went home. Now, here's what you'd expect to happen next, if this were a movie. A ticker-tape parade, headlines. British spy comes home, ceremonies, decorations, her face on every newspaper, the kind of recognition that the sacrifice she made deserved. That's not what happened. What happened was quieter and in some ways more painful than anything the Gestapo had done to her. She came home. She was debriefed. There would have been a formal debrief somewhere. A room with officers and questions, an official account of everything she had experienced recorded in the files of the SOE. She had to tell someone, in that formal context, what had happened to her. What the baignoire felt like, what Ravensbrück looked like from the inside, what the labor camp in Silesia had been. She had to turn all of that into a report, and then it would go into a folder, and the folder would go into a filing cabinet, and the filing cabinet would eventually go into a government archive. You have to be a particular kind of person to do that, to sit across a desk from an official in a suit and calmly describe having your head held underwater by the Gestapo, to describe the shaved head and the threats at Ravensbrück, to go through it systematically, chronologically, with dates and places and the names of people who needed to be flagged as security risks or potential double agents, to treat your own torment as a filing exercise. She did it. She told them everything that was operationally relevant. She kept to herself everything that wasn't. And then she went home. She came home. She was debriefed. The formal reports were written. The paperwork was filed. On February 19th, 1946, King George VI appointed her a member of the Order of the British Empire, an MBE, for services in France during the enemy occupation. The citation noted her cool efficiency, perseverance, and willingness to undergo any risk. The French government awarded her the Croix de Guerre, their highest military honor for wartime service. She received both honors, and then the British government, apparently out of ideas for what to do with former female spies who had survived Nazi torture and concentration camps, wrote a letter to the Helena Rubinstein Organization, a cosmetics and beauty company, describing Eileen as completely untrained but extraordinarily reliable and thorough, and suggesting they might hire her as a trainee beautician. A trainee beautician. The woman who had waterboarded by the Gestapo and refused to break was being offered a job helping women pick out lipstick. I'll let that sit for a second. Eileen went to live in London with her sister Jacqueline, who had also made it through the war, and then, slowly, without anyone making a big announcement about it, she faded out of public life. The war was over. Everyone was trying to get back to normal. The men who had served were flooding back, trying to reclaim jobs and lives. The women who had served in extraordinary capacities, quietly, invisibly, in ways the public never knew about. Most of them went back to being invisible. Eileen developed what the New York Times would later describe as psychological problems brought on by her wartime service. You didn't need a psychology degree to understand what that meant. 9 months of imprisonment, torture, and concentration camps, after months of daily terror as a clandestine wireless operator in Paris. The human mind wasn't designed to process that and come out unchanged. She had nightmares. She had anxiety. She retreated inward. She was, in the parlance that men of your generation would understand, carrying something heavy she never put down. You know what I'm talking about. A lot of you guys watching this have your own version of that. Maybe it's from the service. Maybe it's just from life. The things that happened to you that you never fully talked about. The weight you carry that most people around you don't even know is there. For Eileen Nearne, it was Ravensbrück and the Rue des Saussaies. But the feeling of carrying it, of being alone with it, of the world moving on while you're still back in that room, that's universal. Throughout the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, Eileen lived quietly. She never married. She didn't have children. She didn't write a memoir. She didn't go on speaking tours. When journalists occasionally reached out to former SOE agents for historical documentaries and books, Eileen mostly declined. She had been there. She had done those things. She had almost no interest in talking about it. Think about what those decades looked like from the inside. The 1950s were a time of post-war optimism, especially in America, but in Britain, too, in a more threadbare, rationed sort of way. People were rebuilding. They were getting married, having children, buying houses, watching television, trying to leave the war behind. The men who had served were already developing the habit of not talking about it. You packed that away somewhere. You got back to work. You didn't burden the people around you with what you'd seen. Eileen was doing the same thing, but with something heavier than most, because at least the men who had served were publicly acknowledged as veterans. They had their associations, their remembrance days, their parades. There was a social language for having served, for having fought. For Eileen, the nature of what she had done ruled out even that limited form of acknowledgement. The SOE was a secret organization. What she had done was classified. She couldn't sit at a bar and tell a story. She couldn't explain her nightmares to a doctor without creating complications. She was carrying the weight of someone who had genuinely been through extraordinary things, with no framework whatsoever for sharing it with anyone. The 1960s came and went. The counterculture, Vietnam, all of it. None of it touching the older generation's relationship to the war that had defined them. The 1970s brought the first wave of serious historical work on the SOE, including Professor Foote's landmark official history. Some of the women who had served gave interviews. Some of the networks were detailed in books for the first time. Eileen read those books. She knew the history was being written. She just chose not to be part of the writing of it. By the 1980s, she was in her 60s, living in London with Jacqueline, getting older, carrying the past like a suitcase that never quite fit in the overhead compartment of ordinary life. In 1982, her sister Jacqueline died. Jacqueline had been the bold one, the outgoing one, the one who had been publicly recognized and celebrated as a war heroine during her lifetime. Jacqueline's story had been told. After her death, Eileen moved from London to Torquay, a seaside town in Devon on the south coast of England. She lived alone, quietly, in a small flat not far from the sea. In 1993, she made one public journey back into the past. She traveled to Ravensbrück with a group of other former SOE agents and members of the Special Forces Club to dedicate a plaque to 4 SOE women who had been executed at the camp in 1945, women who had not made it out. Noor Inayat Khan, Denise Bloch, Lillian Rolfe, and Violette Sabo, 4 agents who had been dragged to Ravensbrück and shot or killed there in the early days of 1945, just months before liberation would have saved them. Eileen stood there, in the place where she had arrived as a prisoner, where she had had her head shaved, where she had been threatened with death. And she helped honor the ones who hadn't come home. That's a kind of strength that doesn't get written about enough. In 1997, she agreed to appear on a British television documentary called Time Watch, a program about SOE operations in France. She participated. She talked about what she had done. She described the networks, the transmissions, the work. But she wore a wig. She spoke in French, and she appeared under her code name, Rose. Even 53 years after the war had ended, Eileen Nearne would not fully remove the mask. She had been invisible in plain sight in Paris in 1944. She was invisible in plain sight on British television in 1997. The habit of hiding had never left her. Or maybe it wasn't a habit. Maybe it was a choice. Maybe after everything that had happened, she preferred the privacy. She had earned the right to be whoever she wanted to be. She returned to Torquay. She lived alone. She grew older. And here's the part of this story that hit me hardest when I first read it. Really stopped me in my tracks. Eileen Nearne died in her flat in Torquay sometime before September 2nd, 2010. She was 89 years old. She died alone, and her body was not discovered for several days. It was only when Torbay Council workers came to her flat, trying to figure out who she was and whether she had any family, that they found among her possessions the medals, the MBE, the Croix de Guerre, the papers and documents that told the story of who Eileen Nearne actually was. The woman who had been about to receive a pauper's funeral, what the British call a council burial, an anonymous state-provided interment for people with no next of kin and no funds, was a decorated war heroine who had survived the Gestapo and Ravensbrück. The council workers had no idea. Her neighbors had no idea. Nobody knew. When the story became public, when the medals were found, when the account began to come out, the reaction was extraordinary. From across Britain, across Europe, across the world, people responded. The funeral home that had been prepared to bury her anonymously started receiving calls and emails from strangers who wanted to pay for a proper service. Flowers arrived from all over. Journalists wrote about her. Broadcasters ran features. The Special Forces Club, the organization that serves as a kind of veterans association for the intelligence and special operations community, stepped in to make sure she was honored appropriately. Her niece, living in Italy, came forward. She was upset by the portrayal of Eileen as lonely and unloved. She said Eileen was always cherished by the family, that she had visited her aunt just 6 months before her death, that Eileen had not been forgotten, not by the people who loved her. On September 21st, 2010, 19 days after her body was found, Eileen Nearne was given a proper funeral at the Church of Our Lady Help of Christians and St. Denis in Torquay. A Union Jack was draped over her coffin. The Royal British Legion was present. The eulogy was delivered by Adrian Stones, chairman of the Special Forces Club. Her ashes were scattered at sea, as she had requested. 65 years after she had been parachuted into occupied France, 65 years after she had held her ground against the Gestapo in that torture chamber on the Rue des Saussaies, 65 years after she had survived Ravensbrück and a forced labor camp in Silesia and an SS checkpoint and a cross-country escape through dying Germany, the world stood up and said, "We see you." Better late than never, I suppose. But you can't help feeling the sting of it. This woman carried all of that, alone, for 65 years, and the world only looked when it was almost too late to look. I keep thinking about what it costs a person to do that, to have done what she did, to have given what she gave, and then to come home and find that the world has moved on, that no one's particularly interested, that the best the system can offer you is a job at a cosmetics counter and an MBE that gets stored in a box in a small flat by the sea. And here's the thing I want to say to the men watching this, particularly the ones who have served in some capacity, or the ones who have carried weight that other people don't see. This story isn't just about Eileen Nearne's bravery in France. It's about all of it. What happens after, the silence, the years of living with something no one else fully understands, the way that service, no matter how extraordinary, doesn't protect you from ordinary life, from loneliness, from obscurity, from the gap between who you know yourself to be and how the world sees you. Eileen Nearne knew who she was. She had looked the Gestapo in the eye. She had survived Ravensbrück. She had come home. Whatever the world chose to make of her after that, the label of scatterbrained, the job offer at Helena Rubinstein, the quiet years in Torquay, none of it changed that fundamental truth. She knew what she had done, and she had done it without asking for anyone's applause. The SOE file that was declassified after her death described her as, and I want you to hear this phrasing because it comes from the official British government record, someone with cool efficiency, perseverance, and willingness to undergo any risk. The same officer who called her scatterbrained before the mission described her in the post-mission debrief as having conducted herself with remarkable composure under the most extreme pressure. He had been wrong. He admitted it in his own bureaucratic way by writing down what had actually happened. Eileen had been right about herself all along. Now I want to also say something about her sister Jacqueline for a moment, because the two of them are intertwined in this story in a way that matters. Jacqueline Nearne was also an SOE agent. She worked as a courier in France for 15 months, running documents and messages between resistance groups, traveling hundreds of miles by bicycle and train through German-occupied territory. She was awarded the MBE and the Croix de Guerre, same as Eileen. And when she came home, Jacqueline eventually became more publicly known. She appeared in training films, she gave interviews, she was celebrated during her lifetime. But Eileen never sought that. The two sisters spent decades together in London, living a relatively quiet post-war life. When Jacqueline died in 1982, Eileen moved to Torquay alone. She didn't try to fill the void by becoming more public. She retreated further. There's something poignant about that. This woman, who had once been so thoroughly invisible that she moved through Paris for 5 months without the Gestapo finding her, choosing, in her later years, to be invisible again. Not because she was afraid. She had proven beyond any doubt she was not afraid. But because the visibility felt wrong for her, because the privacy was hers, and she had earned it. I think about the Time Watch documentary in 1997. She's in her mid-70s at this point. She knows the history is worth preserving. She agrees to go on camera and talk about what she did. But she puts on a wig. She speaks in French. She uses the codename Rose. Even then, even in that space where the interviewer knows who she is and the purpose of the documentary is to celebrate her service, even then, she holds something back, keeps something for herself. There's real dignity in that, an insistence on being the author of her own story, even while telling it publicly for the first time. And I want to take a moment here, before we get to the final part of this, to talk about the SOE women more broadly, because Eileen Nearne was one of 39 women dropped into occupied France. They were extraordinary, every single one of them, and the losses were devastating. 12 of those 39 women did not come home. They were captured, imprisoned, and executed, shot or gassed by the Nazis. Some of them were killed at Ravensbrück, which is part of why Eileen made the trip back there in 1993 to dedicate that plaque. She was honoring the ones who had stood where she had stood and not come out. Noor Inayat Khan, Violette Szabo, Odette Sansom, Yvonne Rudelat. These names are slowly becoming more known, but most Americans couldn't tell you who any of them were. They should be household names. They should be in every history curriculum. They were some of the bravest people, men or women, of the entire 20th century. And if you're watching this channel and you've made it this far into this video, you already know that. You're the kind of person who thinks these stories matter. Which brings me to something that genuinely means a lot to what we do here. If you've watched this far and this story has touched something, in you, consider subscribing. That's it. One button. And it tells us to keep digging into these stories, keep bringing them out of the archives and into the light. There are so many more. We're just getting started. Now, let's talk about what Eileen Nearne's story actually means, because I think there are a few things here that go beyond the wartime heroics, as extraordinary as those are, and get into something that resonates with the way real human life actually works. The first thing is this: being underestimated is not the same as being less. Every major move in Eileen Nearne's story involved someone not seeing her clearly, the training officer who called her scatterbrained, the Gestapo interrogators who thought she was just a young girl who could be broken with enough pressure, the British government apparatus that wasn't quite sure what to do with her after the war. At every stage, someone looked at Eileen Nearne and decided she was not quite the thing she turned out to be, and at every stage she proved them wrong, not loudly, not dramatically, not by announcing herself and demanding recognition. She proved them wrong by doing the work. The second thing is about silence. I said this near the beginning, and I want to come back to it, because it's the heart of this story for me. Eileen Nearne kept silent during the torture because silence was the only weapon she had left, but she kept silent for the next 65 years, too. Not because she was ashamed, not because she was hiding, but because she had decided that what she had done was hers. It didn't require an audience. It didn't require validation. She knew what she had done. That was enough. How many people can say that? How many of us, in an age when everything gets photographed and posted and shared and liked, how many of us can do something meaningful and just let it be, without needing anyone else to see it? She did her job. She came home. She lived her life. She died with her medals, in a box in a flat by the sea. And the world eventually came to her anyway. The third thing, and this is the one that I think applies most directly to what a lot of the men watching this have experienced in their own lives, is about the cost of carrying things alone. Eileen developed significant psychological problems after the war. That's the official diplomatic language for what PTSD would have been called if they'd had a name for it in the 1940s. She had nightmares. She was anxious. She withdrew from the world. She self-isolated. She survived physically, but she was changed. And the system around her, the British government, the military structure, the society she came back to, had essentially no tools for helping her with that. What they had was a letter to a cosmetics company and a medal in a box. That was it. That was the full extent of the support on offer. Men of your generation, particularly those of you who served, know exactly how that goes. You came home and you were expected to be fine. You weren't supposed to talk about it. You weren't supposed to need anything. You had the medal, and that was supposed to be enough. The idea that a person who had been through what Eileen Nearne had been through might need ongoing support, ongoing recognition, ongoing human connection. That idea was not on the menu in 1945 or in 1955 or in 1965. She survived, but she survived alone. And I think that part of the story is worth sitting with, because it's not unique to Eileen Nearne. It's the story of a lot of people who gave a lot, in a lot of different ways, and came home to silence. The good news, the thing that I want to leave you with, is that the silence didn't win. It almost got her a pauper's funeral. It almost meant that she slipped away from history unnoticed, unrecorded, unknown. But the medals were in the box. The papers were in the flat. And when the council workers came through the door, the truth was right there, waiting for the world to catch up. Eileen Nearne, codename Rose, was buried with a Union Jack on her coffin and the Royal British Legion in attendance and the Special Forces Club giving the eulogy. Not as grand as it should have been, not as early as it should have happened, but it happened. History did not completely forget her. And now you know her story. You know that a 22-year-old woman with dark hair and a wireless radio ran one of the most effective intelligence operations in Paris in the most dangerous year of the war. You know that when they caught her, they couldn't break her. You know that she walked through Ravensbrück and Silesia and an SS checkpoint and a forest in collapsing Germany and came out the other side. You know that she wore a wig on television 50 years later and spoke French and refused to fully remove the mask. You know that she kept her medals in a box by the sea and never asked for anything more. One more thing. I want to read you the exact words the British government used to describe her in the official citation when they awarded her the MBE, because I think these words are the truest summary of who she was. Cool efficiency, perseverance, and willingness to undergo any risk. Cool efficiency. She never panicked. She packed up before the Gestapo got through the door. She stuck to her cover story through the baignoire. She talked her way past SS guards less than 3 weeks before Germany surrendered. Perseverance. 105 wireless transmissions. 9 months in German custody. 65 years of carrying it quietly, willingness to undergo any risk. She went to France knowing what capture meant. She went to the safe house against her controller's orders because the message needed to go. She refused to work in Ravensbrück when they were threatening to shoot her. Cool efficiency, perseverance, willingness to undergo any risk. Not bad for a scatterbrained girl who was very feminine and immature. Eileen Nearne, born March 16, 1921, in London, England. Died before September 2, 2010, in Torquay, Devon, alone in her flat by the sea. Member of the Order of the British Empire, recipient of the Croix de Guerre, SOE wireless operator, codename Rose. One of 39 women parachuted into occupied France, one of the 27 who came home. She never broke, not once, not one word. If this story meant something to you, and I think it did because you made it all the way here, do one thing before you close this video. Subscribe. It takes less than a second. The channel exists for exactly this reason, to take the stories that history almost forgot and make sure they get told properly, to the kind of people who deserve to hear them. Men who understand what it means to serve. Men who understand what silence costs. Men who understand that the bravest people are sometimes the quietest ones. Subscribe and I'll keep finding them, because there are more, dozens more, women like Eileen Nearne who did extraordinary things and went home and lived quietly and let the world catch up when it was ready. They deserve better. And so do you, Rose. Always Rose, and now you know her name.